I began as a biological scientist working on very technical problems in development. As I went on through my career, I learned more and more that we were starting from the wrong point. We were starting from the technical question, not from what the farmers and the rural communities were really looking for themselves. And so in that process of change, I learned to listen, to try and see things through the eyes of resource-poor rural people, and particularly rural women who are even further disadvantaged, and to rethink the questions we're asking in order to get the right answers that they needed, and in order to think about how innovations can really benefit those communities. So come with me on that journey and let's look at how we can bridge between thinking about technical science and social science, bringing the two together so that the approaches we use are driven by the real needs of rural women, and step by step we can help bring about change, empower them to take on the innovations that they need and that they want.
Welcome to the Catalyst of Change, Advancing Equity and Inclusion in Science. We will be hearing today from an expert advisor in agri-food research and innovation for development, Dr. Mark Holderness, who right after his presentation, will have a conversation with Emily Ingete Amondo, postdoctoral research on gender equity and social inclusion at CIMMYT. There is interpretation available in Spanish, French, and Hindi. To access interpretation, you choose the language of your preference in the Zoom bar menu. This seminar will be recorded and made available on the CIMMYT YouTube channel. We will have an open Q&A session at the end, and you are also invited to submit questions via Slido for the speaker. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Brian Govers, Director General of CIMMYT, to officially open the event and welcome our speaker of today, Dr. Mark Holderness. Dr. Govers, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody online. And I hope you have noticed and enjoyed that we have slightly changed our geographical identity. You can see different colors, but also different tagline: advancing equity and inclusion in science. Because the purpose of Catalyst of Change is to showcase leaders in all kinds of forms who are advancing equity and inclusion in their organizations and communities. We highlight a diverse range of leaders, change makers, allies of women, underrepresented geographies and ethnicities, but also differently abled people, indigenous communities, and other often unheard voices in agriculture, science, and development. Equity and inclusion in leadership are essential to listen, one of our core values, to what are the needs out there and to build effective, ethical, and future-ready organizations. By highlighting diverse leaders, we put equity and inclusion at the center of leadership. We aim to provide role models so we can all learn from other people's journey and improve our own unique institutional leadership style. Leaders bring people with different experiences and views into decision-making, which results in more innovative solutions, not necessarily the first solution at hand. Greater ability to anticipate risks and unintended consequences, see those blind spots, and better representation of stakeholder needs. Therefore, Catalysts of Change are leaders in all sorts of fields and disciplines, because we believe that leadership styles can take many different forms. We invite CEOs, ambassadors, world-renowned scientists to speak in this space about what they have experienced. But today, as you know, we're making a shift. We're also inviting young professionals to navigate how to bring their values of equity and inclusion to their everyday tasks and teams. Representatives of indigenous communities who are advocating for their perspectives to be included and pursued for knowledge and implementation of science. Science communicators, human resource professionals, project management, and others who think of their job not as how do I make more money, but how do I make more impact in the world and leave the world behind better than I found it. Differently abled professionals who share experiences and challenges they face in their growing careers using that different talent that they have. This new tagline is thanks to you, our thoughtful audience. We heard you, we listened to you. You gave us feedback, we incorporated it. One of the main elements we heard was that men can also be leaders in advancing gender equity and inclusion. And we heard you. We agree. Thank you for engaging with us and for continuing to provide ideas, comments, and questions for this very successful and unique series. With this introduction, I'd like to present today's presenter, Mark Holderness, who's an expert advisor in agri-food research and innovation for development. He works to build innovative partnerships between governments, businesses, and farmers that deliver better development outcomes, particularly for smallholder farmers, rural women, and youth. A strategic and visionary leader, I may say. He excels in dealing with complex reality of agriculture and rural development and inspires and drives the inclusive transformation and strengthening of agri-food innovation systems, policies, and programs. Holderness has worked continuously in international development, and you may have come across as he has been working there for nearly 40 years at the highest level, indeed, across more than 60 countries. He has delivered successfully at the director level in the International Science and Development Organization, CABI, in the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and as a member of boards from both the public and the private sector. And let all of those be key partners for the execution of our CIMMIT 2030 strategy. As a matter of fact, as an executive secretary of the Global Forum on Agricultural Research and Innovation for 11 years, he mobilized collective action on key agendas across multi-stakeholder international networks of over 600 organizations and represented the perspectives of farmers and national systems in the reform of the CGIAR system and led 3 highly successful global conferences on agricultural research for development that delivered on an internationally agreed roadmap for change in the sector. Now he's an independent advisor, and he has led external reviews of world's main international agricultural research networks. He reviewed the past decade of CGIAR and has forward-looking review like the one of the Association of International Research and Development Centers in Agriculture. More recently, he has directly advised reform processes of Uzbekistan's National Agriculture Research Advisory Services and Education programs, including formulating the National Agri-Food Research Plan. And that plan may ring a bell with some of you online. He received the 2018 Development Agriculturalist of the Year award from the Tropical Agriculture Association for his outstanding contribution to sustainable agricultural development. Mark, if I may, will have a conversation with Emily, a postdoctoral researcher on gender equity and social inclusion at CIMMIT. Emily Injeta Amondo interests herself in research in inclusive agricultural innovation, food systems, and climate change. Emily holds a PhD in agricultural development economics for the University of Bonn, Germany. She has previously worked as a research assistant with CIMMIT, with ICIPE and the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, AATF, on projects across Eastern and Southern Africa. And today, she's our own postdoctoral researcher at CIMMIT. I think I've been talking a lot and introducing you this new format of Catalyst of Change. So why don't we just kick it off? Without further ado, please welcome today's Catalyst of Change, and a true catalyst it is, Mark Holderness.
Well, thank you so much, Bram. And that's a fantastic introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all those plaudits, but thank you very much. And probably the biggest plaudit is being the first man invited to speak to this series, which is a real honor. And it's actually great that this is through CIMMIT, because I've had a lot of involvement with CIMMIT over the years, and as you mentioned, with the CGIAR as well. But it's great to actually be contributing to the really vibrant processes that you're taking forwards now as well. So perhaps I should tell you a little about my own journey and my own path. I didn't begin as a gender and equity specialist. I began as a very much technical agriculturalist, working after my PhD, working in Papua New Guinea, where I was working on basically standard field experiments, genetics of resistance, control, and so on. But really, those 5 years taught me a great deal about the differences between large farms and small farms, and the reality of small farms, and how they're confronted by so many different issues that go well beyond the straight technology of production. Could I have that one picture up, please? And I found after a few years that actually I wasn't the only one in that way. This map of the universe is actually quite illustrative. It shows where researchers click to look for information. So the closer the clicks, the more they're looking. And if you look down in the bottom right there, you see plant agriculture and agriculture. Now, there is a huge gap between, on the top left, economics, demographics, sociology, and so on. The reality is that agriculture researchers have for a very long time been fascinated at things like plant biotech and so on, derived from medicine in the top right, but so little connection with the social sciences. And that's a theme I'll try and elaborate on now. Okay, back to me, please. And so what I did after Papua New Guinea was I was working then for an international organization, CABI. And that really taught me a lot. I was based in the UK, but traveling all over the world, researching, developing capacities, advising on particular crop protection problems. And it came through that work, the realization that I think the figures are something like 85% of farms in most of those, quote, developing countries are less than 2 hectares. So we're not dealing with extensive monocultures, we're dealing with diverse systems and challenges of them. And that meant also a great deal more as my career developed, as I learned more about listening to the farmers themselves, using processes like participatory rural appraisal before you do anything in the input side, to really listen to what people are faced with, what they see as the challenges, what they see as the constraints that really matter to them. And the other thing that came across very strongly in those processes is that farmers know a great deal more about their farm and their particular situation than I probably ever could. And we then came to some of the specific projects that really did shape my thinking. One was in East India, the Rain-Fed Farming Project, which was very much working with tribal farmers, resource-poor farmers, below subsistence in many cases. And we went in originally to bring in some technological ideas from outside. It was after the first visit, we knew immediately that that was the wrong approach. What we were doing was trying to introduce technologies that had no relevance or bearing to resource-poor farmers. So after that, we had to really totally rethink what might work under their conditions, under their constraints, and what they had available to them there. They had no public sector support whatsoever. And that was a fascinating exercise to go through and challenge yourself. Well, what would I do in their position? What would I do in their constraints? And to be honest, we threw out probably 95% of published science because it was irrelevant to their situation. Quite a shaking observation. And yet these farmers were surviving and getting through the year. I know that even with the PhD, blah, blah, years of experience, if I'd gone into that farm and tried to live for a year, I could not have made it. But these people have social networks, they have knowledge, they know what goes on in their situation, what works, what's worked for their fathers, their forefathers, and what is relevant for their particular needs. And it really taught me to be humble, that we may think as scientists that we know a lot, but we generally know a lot about a very little thing. Whereas farmers have to know a little about many things, about a great lot of things. So there is a marriage to be had between what we can contribute as scientists with our technical knowledge and what farmers' realities are. And the other program that I think really did shape me was working in Bangladesh on seed improvement. Originally starting from a point of what diseases are on the seed, but very quickly realizing that an average farmer's seed batch is horrible. It's actually contaminated. It's got diseases, it's got weed seeds, it's got dirt, whatever. And what generally has been the norm previously is farmers retain a batch of the seed they cook with, the grain they cook with, and they use that as seed. And it's treated as women's work. Oh, the women are responsible for that. But by working with those women, by cleaning up that seed through very simple technologies, hand sorting, flotation in salted water, and so on, we actually found we could really make a difference. And by cleaning up that same batch of seed, we achieved a 14% yield increase across hundreds of farmers. And it wasn't just that they noticed. It was the reduced drudgery, the reduced weeding, the reduced effort required, particularly for the women. And suddenly this thing took off. And it wasn't just about the technology and the working with local innovations alongside scientific knowledge. It was also the ability of women to share their messages. And this was, I have to say, 20 years back or whatever, when video was in its infancy. But we used video made by the women themselves, telling the story in the way they wanted to tell other farmers, integrating local and scientific innovation and expressing it through their own context, their own language, their own preferred way of putting across a story. And the impact has been phenomenal. And that approach has been picked up by an organization called Access Agriculture, who were working with me in the first place. And they now have a coverage of 90 million viewers. And the women farmers in that video, who made that video, local NGOs and women farmers, received a gold award from the International Visual Communications Award. Next thing they knew, they're on a plane to a white collar banquet presentation in London as being recognized as global excellence, women telling their own stories. And the key message there is farmers listen to other farmers. They would much prefer to believe a woman farmer in Bangladesh than a man in a white coat coming in from outside. So communication is critical, I think, in all of these issues. And I think one of the challenges we have in talking about equity and inclusivity is that the metrics and advocacy need to be much, much clearer. We need to be very simple, build from simple steps and be able to express those and communicate those. And I think someone who inspired me on that was Muhammad Yunus, now the president of Bangladesh, Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who recognized that even the formation of the Grameen Bank began from very little steps that need very little money, but challenge conventional approaches and conventional thinking. And I think that's a very important lesson for all of us. So after my cabbie life, I then felt so much that the challenge of institutions and the walls between institutions were what were holding back so much in development. And I took on the role of the secretary of the Global Forum of Agriculture Research and Innovation, which many people said, you must be crazy to try and do something so complex, but it actually comes back to breaking down institutional walls, helping people to work together. And one of those key measures was in gender. We helped to organize the first global conference on women in agriculture in 2012 in Delhi. Big meeting, 700 plus delegates. And really the common messages that came across was the need to reframe agriculture and rural development, recognizing women at the center of those processes and the value they bring both on-farm production, but also household food security and nutrition, off-farm incomes, post-harvest processing, and so on. Really often neglected or given much less prominence in agriculture research and innovation agenda. And that led to the setting up of the Gender and Agriculture Partnership, which was an institution without walls, an organization that everyone can join with to really make a difference. And we managed through that to get a common agenda talked about at the GCARD conferences, at the UNFCCC, the COP meetings of climate change, the World Farmers Organization, and so on. So big ability to get people to speak together for a common challenge, a common concern, and producing position papers and so on at that, as well as picking up specific issues such as farmers' rights and the role of women in seed conservation, which are crucially important issues, but have been neglected for many years and are only now really, I think, being taken up properly. But the message I will bring from all of the collective actions in GFAR is that collective action doesn't just happen. It takes inspiration, it takes a few core people with a common concern. It needs that collective commitment, it needs energy, it needs self-drive, it needs an empathy with other people and the ability to work across institutions. And it doesn't happen overnight. We're dealing with stepwise change and influencing change. And that would probably also be true of the CGIAR reform. And I was on the Fund Council and then System Council of the CGIAR. And I well remember Vicky Wilde, who many of you will know, telling me originally that the CGIR was male, pale, and stale. And I think that was probably quite a fair assessment at that time in the early 2000s. But I was glad to see the pressure we were able to bring through the Fund Council, through the funders, and indeed the role of GFAR in there, eventually resulted in both the Gender Impact Platform and such a huge shift in now having fantastic women at senior levels in the CGIR. So constant pressure can bring a difference. And as Bram mentioned, I more recently produced a synthesis review of the CGIR's research programs, the CRPs, which was fascinating, I have to say, fascinating. And the core distillation, I would say, is that the centers in the CRPs have produced very strong technical inputs, no question, excellent scientific research. But where it fell down was the development impacts, which were probably only about a third of those that were predicted at the start of the decade. And why was that? And to me, it comes down to two core things. One is the inadequate links to national or societal partner needs at the very outset of the program, rather than us as outsiders, if I can say that, thinking we know what's needed. And also the need for the international research system to help enable national capacities and national policy change in order to achieve these things, because we're dealing with big issues that impinge onto societal change as well. And that, I think, general statement is not just about the CGIR, it's about the entire sector. If we don't get our first questions right, if we don't start with the right policies and drivers of demand for innovation, then we're relying on a technological input, a top-down system, essentially, which is linear and leads officially from research through to impact in the field. But there are so many barriers in that process, so many blockages in that flow. So let's think instead of a cycle of innovation where we really focus energy on getting the policies and drivers understood in the first place, and then bringing the pieces together that will lead into generating knowledge and innovation, whether it's research in country, whether it's external research, leading through into just as much importance being placed on how that knowledge and innovation is accessed, adapted, and used by those who it's meant to be serving. And also, of course, looking then at how that leads into enterprise and sustainable development returns. And one good example of that to me is actually Massagro of CIMMYT, where you're really engaged with the country of the host country and showed that you were listening and contributing to that. And unfortunately, to me, that's quite a rare example of a real synergy between the international system and the national system. And the same is exactly true between the national level bodies and the regional and local bodies. Development is a challenge, but we need to begin with understanding real needs, not just starting from technologies. In terms of the role of women, we also need to look much more, I think, at what is gender blind research. For many years, we've been trying to tick boxes about gender. One example that really struck me was at that International Conference on Women, a poster about the drudgery involved in planting rice, which involves 250,000 bendings of people's backs to plant a hectare. Now, can you imagine doing that in a gym? You'd be dead. But women, and it's mostly women, certainly in India, who go out and do the planting, are doing that back-breaking, literally back-breaking work. And I would have thought, whenever it was 13, 14 years ago, I would have thought, oh God, that's a really missed thing. Why aren't we doing more on that? And I recently looked at the IRI publications, and they produced 14,000 staff publications on their library. Do you know how many of those had women in the title? 111. The average previously was 1 or 2 being published per year. But in the last couple of years, that's gone up to 17 a year. And in the last 2 years, there's also 5 on planting mechanization at a local level. I would say one of the big factors that's changed there is they now have an excellent gender expert on staff who's pushing that agenda. And if we let it be sidelined, it will be sidelined. And fundamentally, in all of our research and innovation processes, if we don't ask the right questions that really matter for the farmers at the center of the process, we won't get the right answers. We'll be forever saying, what was wrong with those farmers for not taking up my wonderful technology? Completely the wrong perspective. And so I think another step that hasn't yet really been taken up is truly collective innovation programs. And that takes a certain amount of courage and big picture thinking to bring together all the different elements rather than addressing problems in a sort of stepwise process as they appear. Why can't we tackle them in parallel? We have big development programs, usually or very often disconnected from innovation. Poultry is a great example. Poultry has been tremendously successful, particularly for women farmers, because it's so household focused. But you can't just say, oh, we're going to introduce better chickens, for example, and that will be fine. You have to also think about the feed, about how they cope with heat stress, about housing, about how to vaccinate and develop vaccines for diseases, about how to link small and large scale producers and markets, and about the equity issues with all that. How do women get resource access? How is the income distributed? Workloads involved and so on. But doing that as a package, you can parachute a huge change rather than trying to tackle one piece of that jigsaw and find it doesn't actually work. So I think I'll close there and just, if you'll allow me to quote my own guru, Professor Swaminathan, two key things. First is go ahead and push forward with your ideas and your goal and your common sense. Go on your own way and don't mind too much that others are either praising you or cursing you. If you have a core belief in what you're doing, go with that. And the final one is whatever you do, do it for the good of others. Thank you.
Sorry, Emily, something is happening with your audio. We see that your microphone is open, but we cannot hear you. Oh, maybe if you unplug your earphones, or you try to connect them. There is a kind of
You hear me?
Oh yes, Emily. Now you are back.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Mark, for such an inspiring speech. And hello, everyone. As I work on supporting gender equity and social inclusion elements in development and delivery of agricultural technologies, I'm excited to be part of this conversation. My name is Emily Injete Amondo, and I've prepared a few guiding questions that may be helpful for us in this discussion. Before I begin with the questions, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that in field like science, including agriculture, where women are underrepresented, not only in leadership, but also as scientists, progress has often been supported by committed male allies who create space for inclusive participation. Yeah, recently we marked Father's Day last weekend, and it's also a timely moment to recognize the role that many men play as mentors, colleagues, and fathers in empowering women and shaping more inclusive system. Your work, Mark, and also the leadership at CIMIT reflects this kind of leadership, and we sincerely appreciate it. So to my first question, Mark, your leadership has consistently reflected a strong commitment to inclusion. While the focus on empowering women is essential, men also play a crucial role, especially in addressing cultural issues that hold women back. In your view, what does effective male allyship look like in agricultural research development, and how can we engage more men as champions of gender equity in this space within research institutions and also in farming communities? Thank
It's
you.
a very good question, Emily, and probably one of the big challenges of humanity. I think one of the key points I would make is don't go at it head on. This is not a confrontation. To me, it's much more about working with farm families and helping them to understand the critical need to address both the needs of men and women. Because I think otherwise there's a tendency to say, oh, this is good for women, and then you're excluding the men, rather than actually bringing them along with the process. And for example, that Bangladesh seed program I was talking about, one of the interventions was making drying tables to lift the seed off the wet concrete and allow it to dry with ventilation through it. And the men were very proud that they were making those tables that the women could work with, and they felt valued themselves. So I think that's the point, is it doesn't have to be big interventions. We learn through small steps, and we change our behaviors through small things that actually seem perfectly common sense once we've done them, but perhaps before may seem like alien or wrong in our culture, or whatever it may be. There's just as much of a challenge, I think, at the national level. And I saw this more recently in Uzbekistan, that it's actually quite hard to get policy change if women are not even seen as farmers in the original context. So that, again, that doesn't happen overnight. It's about working with policymakers, but also with people on the ground, and going out and sort of challenging their own perceptions, their own conceptions of what the situation is. And when by name women may be called non-farmers and men are called farmers, that's only a reflection of the traditional patriarchy. It's not about what are they really doing on the ground. And I think if people are helped to stop and think rather than challenged, rather than criticized, if they're helped into that process, then we all want to see that we've made a positive change. I think that's a human thing. But if we're just criticized for it or feel excluded by it, then we have a problem. And that's probably what we're seeing, in a sense, in the US now with the DEI stuff, that if you make someone feel excluded, you're not actually helping the process. But if you help them to understand why change is important, it's a completely different game.
Okay, thank you so much for that response. And then we know that low number of women in leadership and scientific roles in agricultural research is shaped by various factors. Based on your experience, what shifts are needed within organization and across the wider system to create more supportive, enabling environment where women can enter, stay, grow, and lead?
That's another very big question as well. But I think some things are changing. I think if I use the example of India, I think there's something like 37% women graduates in agriculture now. The opportunities are there. But I think it's not just about being allowed into the education system. It's also very much looking at what is the career path after that, and how willing are our employers to take on women with perhaps what they perceive as other challenges, whether they will be soon having children. This is the traditional patriarchal view once again, whether they will be able to go into some of the more remote places, or whether it's safe to do so. So there are reservations that people have that can become real blocks. And so I think each of those needs to be challenged. A proactive shift in employment towards greater women is also something of value. I mean, to me, the importance of having women is huge in the higher levels of any institution. And I think that's where an element of forcing is required. An element of quotas perhaps may be required to make that shift happen. But I would say, again, don't just do it blind. Do it so people understand the implications and the value of doing it, or else it will just have pushback.
Yeah.
And I know people like the World Bank, for example, have a quota in order to try and push the number of women up in senior roles. And that should be a natural thing. And it's allowed many great women to take senior roles in the World Bank. Fantastic. Has it meant that others have felt excluded? Probably it has. And I think this is the danger of how we project these things, how we show that there's an open field, but also a balance to be leveled up again. Because you're absolutely right. There are challenges all through the education system, particularly in some countries. And then not just, it doesn't stop when people leave school or leave college, it goes right into the employment as well. But I think the experience for everybody of where there is a diverse working place has been a very healthy experience. And it does change attitudes, it changes beliefs, it changes ways of working and all those things.
Okay, thank you so much. I know you touched on some of these elements in your presentation, but in a summary, what, in your own view, what has been the biggest missed opportunities when it comes to fully integrating women in agri-food innovations?
Agricultural innovation. I think not listening to the communities in the first place would be the biggest one. The assumption that the scientist knows best is a very dangerous one. And we're sort of fed that, whether in social science or natural science, we're fed the belief that we know because we've been educated in college or whatever it might be, that we're the experts. I think that the biggest thing is not enough humility in the system, to my mind. Not enough willingness to recognize that women farmers, and indeed farm families as a whole, have so much knowledge. I get so fed up hearing about stupid farmers or ignorant farmers. I don't know an ignorant or stupid farmer. I know farmers who are grappling with incredibly complex challenges. And it needs that empathy and humility from the formal sector, if you like, to really get to grips with that. And I think that's been missed in so many dimensions.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And then we also talk about transdisciplinary solution, but sometimes it's often difficult to implement. I think you talked about natural and social sciences. Sometimes we speak different languages, and then it makes sometimes collaboration a little bit difficult, and also sometimes attitude. So in your experience, what has helped this work, the transdisciplinary approach?
It's a very good point. And I think I'd go further than that. I'd say that natural science language and social science language both have their own exclusivity that stops them talking to each other, but also stops them talking to the wider public. I mean, it just is amazing to me that we're seeing such a public pushback against science of all forms, whether it's criticism of inclusivity on a social science point of view, or whether it's criticism of vaccines on a natural science point of view. They have the same root, which is fear and ignorance of not understanding the concepts that we're putting across. Now, whose fault is that? To some extent, it's those listening. To a significant extent, it's those who are trying to communicate. And I think we need to really, excuse me, make things much simpler and much easier to understand, get away from all our technical jargon. I mean, we'll use DEI as I just mentioned. Who understands what DEI even is? It's just used now as jargon, as sort of, oh, I don't like that. I don't even know what it is, but I don't like it because I don't understand it. And the same is probably true of plant biotechnology, for example. So I think we have to really think as either natural or social scientists of what are we really trying to get across here? And when we have things like the science is not based on absolutes, it's based on proportionality of likelihood, is it 95% probability, blah, blah. So I think we also have to be more careful how we put across our messages. And I think the other one is to really bring it down to ways that people can understand it. And that's why I referenced that video work with the rice seeds, that when people understand what they're doing and are allowed to express it in their own way, it's a much more powerful message for that community than it is for you and I as a scientist of whichever form, going in there and trying to sort of tell them this is what it is. Much better to help people to understand it in relevant small terms, if you like, that actually then have a bigger message for when they're thinking about other issues as well. And I think on the gender issue, gender and youth and inclusivity and so on, we also really need to look at the metrics. I mean, one of the big challenges in the CGR as a whole has been that it's very easy to measure how is a particular variety taken up by a farm and taken on into field production. It's much harder to measure how has our work influenced social change or influenced the empowerment of women, for example. Now, I know that Ruth Mines and Dick and people have done some great work on metrics now for empowerment and so on. But I still think we're not grasping that strongly enough. We're not just measuring it, but also spelling out what that means in terms that people can understand. And without those metrics that can be publicly understood, we are failing. And we're failing actually with the funders as well, because it was very clear in the CRPs that the funders were very willing to fund, if I can call it, traditional natural science research, plant breeding, for example, because they could measure an impact at the end of the day and say this was a good thing for our aid money. The ones that suffered were the systems programs because they were trying to deal with much more complex things. And we haven't yet got good measures for environmental resilience. We haven't got good measures for equity and empowerment. And we need those, and we need them in a very simple form that anyone can understand and can propagate on themselves. So yes, we really do have to pay attention to our language, to our way of putting things across, and to the tools we use for communication as well.
Wow, thanks a lot for that advice. And then you've worked alongside many professionals in your career. How can institutions make mentorship more intentional and impactful for women in agriculture, research and development?
I think mentorship is actually a really underused art. I mean, in my work with the Tropical Agriculture Association now, we're running a mentorship program just with a group of us, if I can call us more, well, let's face it, older people coming in to advise a young group through a process, not just a one-off, but actually to work with them to try and respond to their questions. It seems to work much better as a group than as individual mentoring because you have a sort of group dynamic going there. So that's one thing I would say, is that the other thing with a group of mentors and a group of mentees is that if one person doesn't have the right question or indeed the right answer, the other side, someone else might. And you're getting that dynamic interaction between people who are trying to impart their experience and those who are trying to set out in their careers. And I think, formal mentoring, yes, things like obviously supervision of PhDs and so on will happen anyway, but it's the informal of how, again, we help perhaps particularly the more senior people to spend a little bit of time, contribute a bit, put a bit back into an industry that we've ourselves had so much from, had so much enjoyment and pleasure from working in, and try and give back some of that satisfaction so people don't have to reinvent the wheel, don't have to go through some of the same pitfalls that we've gone through, and get away from this idea that there is the global expert, because there's no such thing. We all know a bit of the picture.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think my time is over. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your insight and your continued commitment to inclusive, transformative change in agriculture. It has been a real privilege for me to have a conversation with you and for you presenting on this platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you so much, Emily, for having this exciting conversation and very stimulating reflections with Mark. We invite the audience to participate in the open Q&A session. Be ready to raise your hand, open your micro and your camera. Also, we invite you to submit questions via Slido for our distinguished speaker of today. So we have already a few questions in Slido, and I'm going to start with the first one. How does gender balance impact mission effectiveness and community trust?
It's a very good question. And I think I would say there's no absolutes, because community trust is so based on local context and local societal contexts. So we can't use a broad brush to say do it in this country and it's going to be perfect in another country. But I do feel that even the dynamic of going in with a team of men and women and a team from different institutions, from different sectors, changes the whole perspective. You're not going in, in my early career, I knew I was going in as a researcher on crop diseases, so I wanted to know about crop diseases. Now that, on a linear path, that was absolutely fine. In terms of listening to what that community was really looking for, which was probably nothing to do with crop diseases, it was very poor. And so I really feel there's a need for a much better framing of our questions in the first place, the questions we're pursuing in research and so on. And that's where some of these tools like participatory appraisal, or indeed, well, there are many things like participatory research processes now, of course, in plant breeding or in field schools or whatever. There are many new tools in the last 20, 30 years where we can listen much better to what that community is really challenged by. And then in the case of the India process, we actually stopped trying to do research at all. And we said it's not about research. It's about what we came to call guided experiential learning. It's about thinking with the farmers about what might work for their situation, and then actually working with them. We didn't have answers. We had suggestions. We had things that might work, but it was down to them to test under their conditions with the confidence that we had something to offer rather than just being, why would I try this? And also about testing things under their own risk aversion, risk management strategies. So for example, planting a row of a new variety alongside their crop, not giving up their entire field to that crop and then finding it was a failure. And I think so much of that is about working with the farmers, well, male and female farmers, as a community, rather than working for them. It's seeing them as having something to offer in the innovation process, not just as the recipients of that process. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you very much. And also, we know that a farmer learns from another farmer, so we have to speak the same language as well. No.
Absolutely, and the language we use might not even be what we would think. I mean, that example I gave in Bangladesh of persuading farmers not to use wet concrete floors because concrete floors stay wet after rain and the seed reabsorbs the moisture and gets moldy and so on. And we were trying to find a way to tell that through a video, and it was the women farmers who came up with the idea of getting a man to sit on the concrete and get up and show his wet bottom. And that in one image told a story far better than we could have ever done by trying to do a technical thing. So, people communicate through humor. They communicate through what is understood in their own context, through their own language, their own what appeals to them. And that's what we need to get through, not just the top-down communication, but actually, why would someone in that village listen to someone in that village? How would they put that message across?
Thank you so much. So this question could be for both, for Mark and for Emily, since Emily is also working in social inclusion. Are we asking women the right questions to understand if inclusion initiatives are working for them? And what should we be measuring or listening for?
I think one thing I would say, sorry, Emily, I'll let you answer this, but I mean, one thing I think is, are we sure that they're in a context where they're empowered to say what they really think? And that's why it's often important to have encounter groups, working groups that are just women, where they can speak more freely. Whereas if they're there with their husbands or fathers or whatever, they tend to be sort of made to shut up and sit at the back. So I think, I mean, my introduction to that was actually in Uganda with the PRA process there, where we were asking women banana farmers, because there were mostly women working bananas. And after about 3 hours of asking them all about their problems and challenges, we said the usual thing of, and do you have any questions for us? And the question was, yes, how many bananas do you grow in your country? And I suddenly felt so small. I thought, I'm aware they are looking at me as much as I'm looking at them. And so social interactions are critically important, but creating the right context for that, I think, is where women are free to speak or to communicate away from feeling a pressure from someone else in that room or that system. Sorry, Emily, I need to give you a chance to.
Yeah, yeah. I think you already responded to it well. And I would say it also depends with the tools you're using, because I know there are some tools where you can measure empowerment, and there are different questions that are asked to both husband and wife to get the metrics you want. But it also depends with the environment, as Mark has said, because if the woman feels, if she feels, if definitely these surveys we do them separately, but if she feels that the husband is not being involved, she will not be able to give the right answers. I also have experience from Uganda where we are conducting focus group discussion. We also had separate for men and women, and it was really challenging to get information from the women. It was really difficult. It kept taking us round and round, and my conversation with people outside, especially the men who stay nearby, I tried to ask them why I did have difficulty in getting responses from women, and I was told it was the Karamoja where social norms are very dominant. And one of the person told me that because the men are not there, they might not open up. But to what extent will they open up when the men are there? So I think the environment and the social norm, the structures in place, I think they are the ones that make women not to be able to speak out. Yeah,
I think
thank you.
it's also, sorry, Emily, let me cut across, but I think it's also about what are we really asking? If we go into a village in Uzbekistan, for example, and start asking about cultivating the land, the men will see that's their issue. If we go in more openly and say we're interested also in who is benefiting from that, where does the money get distributed, who has the asset control, and so on, then we're changing the questions, we're changing the frame of that, and we're allowing more space perhaps for women to assert their own value in that system as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Emily. One more question for Mark. What can institutions like CIMIT do to help what can institutions like CIMIT do to help grow equitable and inclusive leaders? What kinds of capacity building or experiential learning opportunities could we provide?
Well, I think one would be within the working context of the engagement you have with particular countries where you're operating. And what I've seen in many countries is not just the CGIR, but international organizations in general have a tendency, I'm afraid, to come in and say, well, I've got a technology to offer you. Can we have a project together? And that's not a healthy way to begin a conversation. In the GCARD processes, we had a dialogue in Tanzania, remember, where by day 2, the national partner said, well, when are you going to ask us about our national strategies? So I think there's a need at all levels for humility in what we're coming with, that we have something to offer, something of great value to offer, but we need to be listening as much as we're pushing an agenda across. And in terms of informing change of women in national institutions, I think the CGI can do a tremendous amount firstly by your own senior scientists and senior technical people coming in as women, showing that you're actually a dynamic part of that system. But also if the national partner of whatever form is not equipped to take up those messages or to think about it, why not run a process directly to address that instead of assuming that you're only there for the technological input? And I think we know that national systems are under-resourced, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa and many other countries of the world. Being under-resourced makes life very difficult and challenging for women to progress in that system as well, particularly challenging. So I would love to see more focus on how the international system, CGIR, IFAD, whoever else it might be, FAO, is really tangibly helping to change the system, helping national systems to rethink their policies and internal processes to do that, instead of it being left to sort of dislocated projects that may happen nowhere near what you're doing in your research frame. So there's a lack of joined up thinking, not just from the international institutions, but also from those who are funding change on the ground, whether it's government money or international money. So little attention to, we need to fix these underpinnings in order for the whole system to work. But I think the international research system has a tremendous knowledge base and a tremendous value to bring, but it's got to come in the right way and not just assume it's coming in riding on the back of a technology, but how about looking at how your partners can really be helped to change in order to be more receptive to this whole new way of working. And I think, again, the Massagro was probably a good example of that, where actually it was embedded much more in the whole process of national development.
Thank you, Mark. So we are about to close our session of today. What words of wisdom, what message or what recommendation could you share with the audience as our takeaway?
I would say be prepared to listen, and be prepared to listen to what your heart is telling you about something. If you think it's about, if you're just coming in with your head saying, oh yes, I know this about that, you will probably fail. If you come in with your heart and say, oh, that's a bit odd, why is it like that? Keep your inquiring scientific social science mind free and open and able to listen, and then think, well, if I go down that path, that's a completely different way of looking at that problem. So I would say keep inquiring would be my message. And also very much think about, who do you really serve? Do you serve yourself? Do you serve your own publications record, blah, blah? Or do you actually serve the communities who are in desperate need of what you have to offer? So put your ego aside, focus on what you can do for other people.
Thank you so much. This is a very wise reflection, and we will take it with us. On behalf of Dr. Brangovers, Director General of CIMMYT, we thank Mark Holderness so much for sharing with us your outstanding professional and personal journey. Thank you for being a catalyst of change.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. We thank the audience that joined today, and we invite you to the following Catalyst of Change seminar. Thank you so much.